Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig here in our beautiful BL studios in tranquil Tysons, Virginia, here with my friend and colleague John Tamny. John, how are you?
I'm great. Good to be back.
Great. So hard to believe summer's wrapping up and football's around the corner, college and pros. So getting ready to crack open that pumpkin spice beer?
Something like that.
Okay. Well, if you're not into that, I'll get you into that habit. But that's a whole other conversation. We're here today to talk about an article that came out in Barron's a couple of days ago, entitled "Beware What Lies Beneath Tranquil Markets." And I found it to be a really interesting article. And the premise of the article asks the question of, although we have for the most part been noticing profitable, sizable gains in the equity markets, both here and abroad. Of course, they have their shares of bumps and turbulence, but it's been a pretty darn good market over the last year. Are there any macro risks or black swans that lie beneath the surface that pose risks to the economy in the United States market? The ones that they list for potential black swan risk are pandemic, climate change, populism, anti-globalism, and a small handful of others. And when I saw that article, I thought about it immediately, and also noticing just the other day that Palantir, a very reputable company based in Colorado with a large corporate presence here in the Washington, D.C. area, in addition to holding nearly $2.5 billion in cash, just acquired $50 million in gold bars. And when the company was asked why it did so, they described it as a, quote, hedge against a possible black swan event. So it got me to thinking, are we being too tranquilly naive, or is there something that lies beneath? Someone's going to be right and someone's going to be wrong on this. In terms of some real risks that are lurking out there, what are your thoughts?
Well, in thinking about this before the show, I was reminded of an Entertainment Tonight from around 1995, and they were asking a gossip columnist, what are the big future gossip stories? And she said there's no way of knowing. And her point was, how could we have predicted the O.J. Simpson murders? And it's the same idea here. If there's a black swan that we know about, well, it's no longer a black swan.
True.
Markets aren't ideological, they're not bubbly, they're not negative. Markets quite simply are. They're relentless processors of information. So what's known is broadly being priced right now. What moves markets way up in a day or way down is surprise information, and by its very name, surprise, you don't know it until after the fact.
Now, I'm gonna challenge your thesis there a little bit, because in my view, there's two kinds of unforeseeability of a catastrophic black swan event. There's the kind where you never saw it coming, and then there's the other kind where you saw the issue and you thought it was serious, but you didn't think that it could be potentially catastrophic. So if I just go through the list of what Barron's was listing as climate change, populism, anti-globalism, and authoritarianism, it got me to thinking, because when I was thinking about their reference to populism and authoritarianism, then I started thinking about violence and disinformation in January 6th. And although we knew that there was going to be a lot of protests on January 6th, I think that most people did not foresee that there would not be a peaceful transition of power in Washington. It happened. Everybody got back to work. They rolled up their sleeves, and obviously there was no coup. So I don't want to over-dramatize what happened, but I don't think that I can undramatize it either, because there was bloodshed, there was death, and there was a lot of disinformation that led to a lot of violence and a few hundred prosecutions right now. Do you see any risk to capitalism through any currencies of populism or authoritarianism that presents any kind of an institutional risk to the democratic and free flow of the United States stock market?
Oh, without question, there's always risk, but I subscribe to the view that that's the beauty of the markets. They do your worrying for you because they're always processing the possibility. If tomorrow, let's say, a Republican senator dropped dead in a state that's purple, you might see stocks respond negatively because that could very much shift the balance of voting power in Washington. In much the same way, you could see the reverse if it were in let's just say a blue state trending red. And so there's always big surprises, but at least in I can think of numerous things that would terrify the markets. We can talk about the lockdowns last year, but why did markets react so negatively to the lockdowns? They did because it was wholly unexpected. No one expected the freest nation on earth to suddenly have a quarter of its economy essentially in lockdown. If you'd predicted that, you would have been right, but that, again, that was surprise. The virus wasn't a surprise. We've been pricing that for months. It's been traveling the world for months. It's the unknown. It's the man-made that happens out of the blue that is the black swan, but it's only a black swan after the fact.
The CDC, through Dr. Fauci and others, were saying as recently as a couple of weeks before the lockdown that they felt that things were under control. There were even some indications that there were instances where they would not recommend and need to wear a mask. Now, granted, there was a need to catch up on a lot of information because it's a unique virus, but part of the element of the catastrophic immediate shutdown of the government was based upon things that could have been very much man-made, and that's a whole other China conversation. But to share my thoughts on that, I agree with you that, and I believe that there have been people that have, before COVID-19, had TED Talks and talked about viruses and our unpreparedness globally. Bill Gates, I believe, before he ended up being talked about for a lot of other reasons that were a lot more salacious. But back in the day, he was talking about pretty dire predictions and saying that we wouldn't be ready for something, and when in fact, at least in that regard, he was right. One of the things that I find to be one of the dangers of a potential black swan is where the swan might have given us a flyby, showing a risk, and we're such a complacent country, living such a comfortable life that we discount it or we disregard it. I think that the issues that Berens noted with regard to populism and authoritarianism, and I would add to that disinformation, are really big problems that led to a problem on January 6th that much of the Congress doesn't even really want to talk about or dig into, and I understand a lot of that is because of political reasons, and I'm not looking for a political conversation here, but the reality is that as a country, we are too big to turn on a dime. It's like trying to, turn the Titanic when you see an iceberg right in front of you. You've said that you don't see something of immediacy or in the short term that you can, and of course, also given the nature of a black swan, that you don't anticipate something over the horizon. And I take a little bit more of a pessimistic view. But from a global perspective, what could be a substantial risk of a black swan that could occur within the next 12 months? There are so many things that are going on in the world right now from a geopolitical military standpoint, from the perspective of climate change. Do you see something that you think could be a potential candidate that could fall into that category?
Well, let's look at global warming just as an example. And to be clear, I'm not a scientist. I know nothing about science, and I'm not about to talk about science.
That makes two of us.
Yes. But I do follow market signals. And I've often heard from the dire predictions that, well, because we're not doing something about this, that black swan, to use your words, has been doing flybys for quite some time because
Right.
we're not doing anything.
Severe weather.
People use all sorts of examples, and what I've heard is that the result is going to be that 80 of the world's biggest, most prominent coastal cities face going underwater due to inaction.
Are those cities in the United States?
Around the world.
Around the world, okay.
To which I respond, well, that's really interesting because in the U.S., but realistically around the world, the most valuable property in the world tends to be coastal. Are all these people incredibly stupid? In which people will say, well, but this is rich people, they don't care. But wait, I thought I heard that rich people are greedy. At which point,
No.
44% of the world's population lives in coastal cities, and that number is rapidly advancing. It's not going the other way.
Interesting.
The world's population is the ultimate market. Is the market not just stupid, but jaw-droppingly stupid, not seeing what scientists say science tell us? Or is the science a little bit alarmist? Because market signals tell us, based on where people live and where so much money and wealth is concentrated, that whatever you think about global warming, it doesn't threaten the world's greatest cities, at least if you believe markets.
So the market is telling us, don't overreact.
Yeah, the market's telling us that wealth continues to flow into right where scientists say is about to go underwater. I'm saying half of the world's population is exponentially smarter than thousands of scientists, not because the scientists aren't smart,
Right.
but you're combining the aggregated knowledge of half of the world's population. That's always going to beat the knowledge of the few. It's why communism failed. It's not that Russia didn't have brilliant experts or the Soviet Union didn't have experts. It had remarkably brilliant people. But you can never substitute the genius of the few for the marketplace, which is people.
So let's go with that for a moment. The Soviet Union, and for a time before it collapsed, Russia was very adept at misinformation. We saw how they initially handled their own black swans, or let's just call them catastrophes, like Chernobyl. Obviously, there was a lot of misinformation there. We're in a democracy. We have freedom of the press. We have the First Amendment. We have freedom of assembly. But, a lot of people's perceptions are based upon their access to the media of their choice. And there are some people that are looking at issues like climate change as well as others, and they're getting their views from people who are not experts either, and maybe they're really getting pulled into more of a political ideological direction. Maybe, do you think that part of the reason why people, let's just take the United States for example, let's just keep the conversation as concrete as possible. Do you think that part of the reason why people in the United States are ignoring these kinds of significant issues is because they don't understand them based upon their diet of media?
It's a great question. I would put it two parts. I'll first say that disinformation doesn't last, certainly in a free society, but it didn't even last in the former Soviet Union. They wanted to hide Chernobyl.
Right.
But even with primitive media, we still knew about it very quickly. You can't hide catastrophe. And let me add to that when I hear people say the Chinese covered up coronavirus, oh please, you could no more cover that up in an age of dense smartphones around the world. Are you joking? What could they have possibly covered up given information flows? Even if they wanted to, we were going to know very quickly if it was killing a lot or a very few, or if it was making sick a lot or a few. There was no cover-up. That's impossible. Now, thinking about the diet for Americans for media, same thing. Reality ultimately reflects. And so if Americans are wrong or right, or they're consuming the wrong information about global warming and all this, ultimately markets have their say. And if it's a problem, it's going to reflect itself in prices in ways that would be very gruesome if some of the predictions out there have any validity to them.
So part of what you're saying and part of what I'm hearing is the truth, whatever the truth is, and for whatever it's worth, and the truth sometimes is it's like the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. The truth is in the mind of the listener. The truth's going to come out. People are going to hear it. It's not going to be like a tree falling in a forest, and the marketplace of ideas will deal with that, and therefore we're not going to be in a Soviet-type society where you have true suppression of any truth, and therefore that's going to ultimately blend into capitalism and not present a significant risk of fracture in the market.
Unquestionably. Let's use another example. Remember Tiananmen Square.
Mm-hmm.
If you do a search for that on typical internet in China, there's no mention of it. But any Chinese person with passable computer skills, and there's a lot of them, can get all the information they want about Tiananmen Square in China on the internet. Facebook, if you just land in China and open up your phone, you cannot get on Facebook or Twitter. But there are all sorts of Chinese people in China who are on Facebook and Twitter. Capitalism is way too fast for government. China tries to suppress information. Oh, please. The information always gets out there. By the time they, quote, suppress it, it's already out there. And that's more and more going to be true.
It really lends to the question of what's a more effective suppressor or darkening of information. Sometimes a democracy, sometimes a free country with very divergent aspects of media might have the unique capability of masking the truth or of shading people's perspectives. I was noticing a trend on some of the conservative news channels over the last couple of weeks where some of the very high-level prominent talk show hosts, I'll just mention one, Sean Hannity, have gone and cut some public announcements encouraging people to get vaccinated and saying, you need to get vaccinated, you need to take care of yourself, you need to take care of your family. Well, truth be told, there have been some indications from that channel, as well as from other channels, and I think that both sides of the political aisle are probably roughly equally guilty of inaccuracy. But some people, when they're being told by a Sean Hannity to get vaccinated, their mind's already made up, and they've already been told that it doesn't work, and that it's going to allow the government to track them, and it's fake. And this is something that is relevant to the topic because obviously the pandemic and the spread of the Delta variant has had a pretty significant impact on the economy. Now, the market doesn't seem to be terribly concerned about it. It was down yesterday. It's recovered a bit today, but I think that questions of media literacy are going to end up being a big deal. And I know that we have to kind of wrap this conversation up shortly, but in conclusion, do you or do you not think that there is something quietly on the horizon, let's just say within the next 12 months, either at home or abroad, that you've seen that gets you to thinking a little bit in the back of your mind, this could potentially create a real significant, huge risk to the stability of equity markets here in the United States?
Well, the dollar always worries me because the dollar is unstable, and that's a discussion we've had before. Mm-hmm. Do I see other things? I subscribe to the view that the seeds of downturn, of recession, are planted during good times, and the seeds of recovery are planted during bad times. During good times, we're human. We frequently develop bad habits. Maybe we get up later. Maybe we don't exercise as much. Maybe we have an extra drink. Who knows? Mm-hmm. It's during, quote, recessions, individual recessions, that we fix what we're doing wrong. And that's why I've always argued it's so dangerous for politicians to fight recessions. Recessions are the sign of the recovery on the way. We're fixing our errors. Good companies relentlessly rush to their mistakes. They look for them to fix them right away. Recessions are healthy. And so it's not unreasonable to speculate that during these good market times, companies are making mistakes. They're reaching in ways that's going to come back to bite them, and it's going to force a retrenchment in the future. But see, to me, that's healthy, and that signals long-term growth. A true downturn and a black swan is almost always man-made. Let's never forget, people always say, well, what about 2008? We saw that black swan coming. Guess what? Over 90% of the mortgages issued from 2006 to 2008 ultimately performed. Mm-hmm. Failure in the marketplace can never cause a crisis. What caused a crisis was, think back to George W. Bush's statement that I believe in free markets, but the markets aren't working right now, and we've got to intervene. No, markets have no ideology. They just are. It's when politicians say we must do something, as in we are going to substitute the marketplace, which is relentlessly fixing things, and we're going to move in our intervention. Politicians are the crisis, and so the black swan, I will remain of the view, the black swan is man-made. It's political. But when people say they can predict it, they're lying. When people say they predicted 2008, oh, no, you did not, because you had to predict that they would get in the way and disallow the failure of Bear Stearns, that they would tell the markets right up to Lehman Brothers' failure that we're in fact going to save it when they couldn't. Could Lehman have ever caused the global economy to shudder if there's no intervention in the first place? Let's not forget that Enron was a much bigger company. All sorts of counterparties a few years ago. A few years before that, it didn't cause a global economic correction.
Right.
It's the intervention that's the crisis. It's the intervention that's the black swan, which is why you can never predict it.
And the origination, the architecture of those sorts of activities are from here in Washington, right?
Washington is the black swan. It was in 2008. It was in 2020.
I love it. I love it. That's so great. I would say in wrapping this up that, first of all, I think that you raise a great point that the bureaucrats in Washington, can break things a lot more effectively than they can fix them. I think that there was a good point in the Barron's article where they were pointing to risks of populism and authoritarianism. And when I overlap that with disinformation and seeing what happened during what was in part a non-peaceful transfer of power, I believe that the risk of a black swan or becoming real problem is really the fracturing of America. You have people, very good people with very different points of view that are becoming violent. And the violence isn't just on January 6th. There's violence that's happening more increasingly, and domestic terrorism is taking on a new face. And the fact that what happened leading up to, including but beyond January 6th, is something that isn't getting more attention, a little bit more concern, is something that I find really surprising. And the only way that you can fix a problem is to confront it. But John, again, a really interesting conversation. Really do appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again in a few days.
Yes.